Somewhere in the Arabian Sea, a search is still going on for a single American sailor. He went down with a helicopter that fell out of the sky over open water on the 1st of July. And as of the moment this sentence is being written, nobody has found him. The Navy says there's no sign of an attack. No missile, no warning. Just a Seahawk helicopter, 4 crew aboard, on a routine flight from one of the largest warships in the world, suddenly making an emergency landing in the sea. 3 of those crew members are accounted for. 1 isn't. And that single, unresolved detail is sitting quietly in the middle of the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet right now, at the exact moment Iran just issued a threat that has everyone from oil traders to 4-star admirals paying very close attention. Because 2 days after that helicopter went down, Iran's military command came out and said something very specific. Every tanker moving through the Strait of Hormuz has to use Iran's approved routes now, or face what they called a forceful response. And they didn't stop there. They added that if American forces so much as interfere, that interference would be met with what they called a rapid and decisive reaction. Read that twice. That's not a vague warning aimed at oil companies. That's a direct line drawn in the water aimed at the United States Navy, which at this exact moment has more ships packed into this one stretch of ocean than almost anywhere else on Earth. To understand why one sentence from Tehran can move oil markets and put military planners on edge, you have to understand what this waterway actually is. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that gap passes roughly 1/5 of all the oil the entire world consumes, and close to 1/5 of the planet's liquefied natural gas. It is, in the most literal sense, one of the tightest choke points in the global economy, and right now, sitting in and around that choke point, the United States has something like 27 Navy ships, 3 separate aircraft carrier strike groups, more than 16,000 sailors and Marines. That's not a patrol. That's close to half of the entire United States Navy's actively deployed fleet, concentrated in one place because of one country. So how did it get here? Because this didn't start last week. Back at the end of February this year, the United States and Israel carried out a coordinated set of strikes inside Iran, hitting military sites, nuclear facilities, and senior leadership. Iran's supreme leader at the time, Ali Khamenei, was killed in those opening strikes. Iran responded the only way it had left, hitting back with missiles at Israeli cities and at American bases scattered across the Gulf. And then, within days, Iran did something it had threatened to do for decades, but had never actually followed through on at this scale. It shut the Strait of Hormuz, not partially, fully. It told the world that any ship trying to pass through without Iranian permission would be considered a target. What followed was 5 straight weeks of open warfare. The United States sent in 5,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to try and destroy underground missile silos along the Iranian coast. A-10. Thunderbolts and Apache helicopters were sent in specifically to hunt down the fast attack boats Iran was using to threaten shipping. Israel assassinated Iran's top naval commander, the man overseeing the entire blockade operation. And in April, when talks in Islamabad collapsed, President Trump ordered a full naval blockade of Iran's own ports, telling his commanders to stop, intercept, and if necessary, sink anything trying to move in or out. Now, here's the part that should genuinely surprise you if you haven't been following this closely. A ceasefire actually happened. Not once, but it held long enough that by mid-June, both sides had signed an actual memorandum of understanding, a real diplomatic framework meant to end the war permanently within 60 days. Trump signed it in person with Iran's president in Versailles, of all places, during a dinner with the French president. The blockade was lifted. For a moment, it looked like this thing that started with assassinated leaders and sunk ships was actually going to end at a dinner table in France. It didn't stay that way, because on paper, the war ended in June. In practice, it never really stopped. Iran kept demanding that ships follow routes it designated, kept a presence around the Strait's key islands, and kept striking vessels that didn't comply. One tanker after another got hit. A container ship called the Ever Lovely, struck by a drone off the coast of Oman. Another vessel, the CMA-CGM San Antonio, hit by what's believed to have been a cruise missile. 8 crew members injured. Each time the pattern repeated almost exactly. Iran strikes a ship. The United States responds with what it calls a proportional self-defense operation, hitting radar sites, drone storage, missile infrastructure along Iran's southern coast. Iran calls it aggression. The 2 sides quietly agree to stand down. And then it happens again. And somewhere in that cycle, an American Apache helicopter got shot down by an Iranian drone while patrolling directly over the strait. Both crew members were pulled out of the water safely by an unmanned rescue drone, which is its own small miracle of modern engineering. But the fact remains, a U.S. military aircraft was brought down over this waterway, less than 2 weeks before that Seahawk went down off the George H.W. Bush with a sailor still unaccounted for. So when Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya command released that statement on the 2nd of July, warning tankers about approved routes and warning the United States about interference, it wasn't coming out of nowhere. It was coming after months of a ceasefire that exists mostly on paper, after a helicopter shoot-down, after a missing aviator, and after a string of tanker strikes that never actually stopped, even though the war was declared over. Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander overseeing U.S. forces across the entire region, responded within days by meeting directly with senior military officials from Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and nearly every other country bordering that stretch of water to talk through what CENTCOM called the current regional security environment. That's the deliberately careful diplomatic language militaries use when they don't want to say the word crisis out loud. And retired General Jack Keane, someone who has spent decades around exactly this kind of decision-making, said out loud what a lot of people in Washington are reportedly thinking privately. He said Trump is not reluctant to use military force to bring Iran back to the table, and that if Iran keeps violating the terms of this agreement, the realistic outcomes are either another round of limited strikes or, in his words, full-out major combat operations, born out of frustration that Iran is never going to make a deal that actually holds. There's one more detail sitting underneath all of this that almost nobody is talking about, and it's strange enough that it deserves a mention. Iran has been holding a massive days-long funeral for Khamenei since he was killed back in February. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was named as his successor. And in the months since this war began, Mojtaba Khamenei has not been seen publicly, not once. There are reports, unconfirmed, that he was injured in the same initial strikes that killed his father. Nobody outside a very small circle in Tehran actually knows the condition of the man who is technically now leading the country, issuing threats against the United States Navy. So where does that leave things right now this week in the Strait of Hormuz? You have a missing American sailor whose disappearance still has no explained cause. You have Iran demanding control over which ships get to move through one of the most economically important waterways on the planet and threatening a rapid and decisive reaction if the U.S. Navy gets in the way. You have the United States sitting on nearly half its active fleet in that exact stretch of water, 3 carrier strike groups deep, watching and waiting. And you have a country making these threats whose own supreme leader hasn't been seen in public since the war that put him in power began. None of this guarantees another war. Ceasefires get tested and survive all the time, and plenty of tense standoffs in this exact waterway have ended in a phone call rather than a missile. But the pattern here is not a single flashpoint, it's a cycle, one that has already repeated itself more times than most people realize, each time with slightly higher stakes than the last. And the honest answer, the one nobody in either Washington or Tehran can give you with certainty right now, is which direction this particular turn of the cycle is going to break. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz in the next few weeks may end up being one of the more consequential moments of this entire year. And right now, the only people who actually know what comes next are the ones standing on the decks of those ships.